lead off, but my task today was really just to begin the conversation for this community. And to do so, David and Lee asked me to give a little bit of history about SDT and education, which I probably won't do, and a bit of an overview so that we're all in the same discourse and sharing the same language for the subsequent meetings that we have. I'm hoping that people can see my screen that I just opened up. Is that true?
Yep,
Okay,
all good.
good. So, today I really want to just give an overview of SDT and education, but I really want to begin too by thanking Shannon Sarasoli, who is very humble, doesn't really describe all the things that she does, but she's the director of the Center for Self-Determination Theory, and probably everybody on this call is familiar with the CSDT website. Part of the reason I put this up is that this is one of the website, this program that we're doing today, the conferences that we have, they're all emanating from the Center for Self-Determination Theory, which is a nonprofit organization. We try and give SDT away in every way we can. And so I just say that by way of those of you who are participating today. If you know any people who need something to donate to, you'll notice up in the top corner, there's a donate button to CSDT. We really depend upon the generosity of our members to do the services that we do, including today's program. And I just wanted to say one other thing about the CSDT website while I'm on it, which is that this community in education has its own page. It's an education page, and you see right there the pictures of Lee and David. This is a page where we're going to be sharing techniques, strategies, ideas in applying self-determination theory in schools. So I just direct you to this page as a resource for all of you who are interested in education. Today, again, I'm just going to give a brief overview of SDT and education and really not much of a history. But if I think about something that characterizes SDT, sometimes we use the phrase that it's kind of a Copernican turn in the field of education. When Ed Deci and I started in this work, really the field was dominated by the viewpoint that using reinforcements or punishments or sanctions and rewards, you could get people to be motivated to engage in learning. And that was the dominant paradigm of the period in which we started, which, I say with great angst, back in the 1970s and early 80s when we were beginning this work. We were really going against the grain of a world in which we thought that motivation came from the outside. And we were thinking differently about learners, which is that they have an inherent curiosity, inherent desire to know. We all want to grow and learn and become more competent in the world. So how can we support and unleash those inner forces rather than how can we cajole and pressure people from the outside? And sometimes we call that the Copernican turn in the field of motivation, which I think has gone a long way, not just in SDT, but other theories. But I think we were early on in that process. When we started our work, back in that day, Ed Deci was already doing work on intrinsic motivation. And I met him at the time, and I had an interest in very similar topics within mostly psychodynamic theory, the synthetic function of the ego, the conflict-free energy that people have in order to engage their environment. But when I saw his concept of intrinsic motivation, I was immediately drawn to it, realizing that that's the concept that I was interested in as well. And so when we started our work together, we both agreed that intrinsic motivation was an expression of the inherent growth tendencies that every human being has, the desire to learn, to master, to assimilate, to connect it with our environment. We saw that there in every child. There's no child that doesn't have intrinsic motivation. Even at that time, I was beginning my work in developmental disabilities. And even with profoundly and severely developmentally delayed people, we could find evidence of intrinsic motivation and desire to grow and to learn. And so Ed and I were interested in what are the conditions under which we can support and enhance the intrinsic motivation that learners have. And we found in that early work, as I'll talk about subsequently, that particularly support for autonomy and support for competence to feel effective in what you're doing are things that were essential to catalyzing that intrinsic motivation. And in our very early studies, we went right to schools as a place to take a look at this. Of course, intrinsic motivation is obvious everywhere in life. It's obvious in work. It's obvious in just general play. But a place that it's really important is in the classroom. And we were interested in kids' curiosity and interest in the classroom. And in our very first studies, we did an assessment with teachers. We asked them to report on their own teaching style. So teachers reported that we gave them problems in schools to analyze, and then some of the teachers would report that they would use more controlling techniques. Other teachers reported that they would use techniques that we called autonomy supportive. And then we followed the students in the classrooms of these teachers that we had surveyed over the next year. And this is just a snapshot from that longitudinal study that we did. This is 5 weeks into the school year, and we could see that teachers who were more autonomy supportive had children in their classroom who wanted more challenges rather than easier things. They were curious about their schoolwork. They were more independent in trying to go about learning the materials from school. But I think particularly striking to us was that 5 weeks into the school year, if you had a teacher who was supporting your autonomy, you not only felt more cognitively competent, more able to do schoolwork, but also felt better about yourself in general. And we saw that the importance of that finding, and that really for me was almost the conversion issue, because this was an early study for me, but I was a clinical psychologist intending to go to private practice. But I saw the importance of this research and really turned myself toward the study of intrinsic motivation fully. Now, since that early time, we've seen a lot of growth in self-determination theory and the study of education. If you look on this chart, it doesn't even go back as far as those early studies in 1980, but you can see 1980 to 1999, almost a minuscule amount of studies that were being done. This is Google Scholar, just a search for education plus SDT in publications. And you can see now there's over 25,000 publications a year on the topic of education and SDT that Google Scholar search engines are picking up. So there's just been tremendous growth in this area, kind of amazing to me particularly, but I think to all of us, we should be amazed at how quickly this has grown. I'm just going to say one quick thing that I hadn't intended to say here, but I saw a meta-analysis recently from Josh Howard and his group where they were looking worldwide at students' ratings of teachers' support for autonomy. And they have shown that over the past 20 years, teachers have become more autonomy supportive across the globe. The effect size is small, but the scale of it is huge. So it does show that there's been a little bit of progress in this field. Now, across all the work, though, across all those decades, really our question has always remained the same: is how can we enhance the flourishing of students? How can we help people find that energy to grow and to be vital? And also, what is it that gets in the way in our social environments that hinders or inhibits that intrinsic motivation and that natural desire to assimilate that's out there? So that's the kind of fundamental question of SDT. And again, it comes back to our assumption that all human beings are born with the capacity to flourish from whatever their levels of abilities are, to grow, to become more competent, to connect with other people, and that this is just in our nature, and that what education should do is be supporting that propensity to flourish. I was a co-author on an article with mostly a bunch of philosophers recently that was led by Randall Curran. And in there, we were looking at the aims of education, what the proper aims of education would be. In writing that paper, we reviewed a number of UN conventions and the Convention on the Rights for Children. And we note that in all of these international conventions, the development of children's flourishing has been endorsed by almost everybody. For instance, in 1989, the Convention on the Rights of the Child said, the development of a child's personality, talents, mental and physical abilities to their fullest potential should be the goal of education. And we fully agree with that. Only one nation declined to sign on to that proposal. So it suggests that indeed people do value students flourishing, and education ought to be a vehicle for that to happen. But as I think all of us know, it's not always that way. So in our work, in the work in self-determination theory, we thought, well, what are the conditions under which people flourish, and particularly learners in schools would flourish? And we came to a concept of basic psychological needs, that there are some essential experiences people have to have in order to be having that sense of flourishing and engagement that's going to lead to that growth. And when we use the word need, we use it in a very particular way. We mean something that's essential to a living entity's growth, integrity, and well-being. And a need is something that when you're deprived of that need, there is degradation and harm. But when you're supported in that need and it's satisfied, then you can see evidence of thriving. And we see that not only are there physical needs, but there are also psychological needs, and they're natural to all of us. They're universal, and they don't have to be valued. They still have functional importance. And these are the things that the psychological experiences that are essential to growth and to wellness and to integrity in the classroom and beyond. And using that definition, we've really honed in on three central basic psychological needs: the needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness that I'll talk about today. We argue a lot about fourth and fifth needs. We don't rule them out, but these are the ones that meet all that criteria of essentialness for growth, integrity, and wellness, and the thwarting of which also harm. And so we look at both sides of this equation, how satisfaction of basic psychological needs leads to fuller functioning and greater well-being, whereas the frustration or thwarting of basic psychological needs leads to defensiveness, ill-being, disengagement, and depletion of energy. I know that a lot of this, what I'm talking about today, is going to be familiar to so many of you in the audience. I see so many familiar faces here, and I do apologize for the redundancy of this, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page with the concepts and the materials here. So again, just apologizing for redundancies, but I want to say something about each of these basic psychological needs and what they mean. And the first one is the one that I think all educators care deeply about, which is the need for competence. I think every student wants to feel effective and successful when they're undertaking activities. And when they can't feel that, they will disengage. People also would not only want to feel effective at a task, but they want to feel like they're going someplace, that there's growth involved, and they want to experience challenges and develop their skills and extend their ability. And when they have that feeling that that's what's happening, then we really have their presence in the classroom. On the other hand, when there's an absence of feedback or there's negative feedback, we see that engagement diminish as well as growth. So competence is really that psychological need to feel that sense of effectiveness and opportunities for growth in your environment. When we look at the need for relatedness, here again, we think every human being needs to feel connected with others and have a sense of belonging and inclusion. And this is particularly important in school-related environments, both for teachers and children alike. But everybody wants to feel like they matter and that they're respected and significant in the environment they're in. It's not that they have to be the most important person in the room, but it has to be that it matters to others that they're there, that they feel welcome, that they feel that they're cared about in that environment. And it's not just feeling cared for, but it's also the opportunity to be able to contribute to others and participate in a group that really breeds relatedness, as we'll see in the evidence. And then finally, the need for autonomy, which is kind of I'd say, a unique need within self-determination theory, or at least the emphasis on autonomy is really unique. Autonomy has to do with feeling willingly engaged in what you're doing. If I'm autonomous about giving this lecture today, I'm doing it willingly because I'm finding value or interest in doing it. If you're attending this lecture today, hopefully you have well, you must be, because there's no reason for you to be here otherwise, some willingness to be engaged and to be present here for this. So autonomy is really about feeling self-regulated, initiative, volition in what you're doing. And we have really two forms that autonomy takes within self-determination theory. One is you're spontaneously autonomous because you're intrinsically motivated to be engaged. And the other is that you're autonomous because you really value the activity, even if it's not intrinsically motivating. You know why it's worthwhile, and that's why you engage in it, and that's the need for autonomy. So promoting all three of these basic psychological needs are really essential to the classroom environment. And let me just say again, for all of you familiar with SDT, we know autonomy is a very unique concept in our theory. And when I say that, I want to make sure that we distinguish it from some other ideas that get confused with it sometimes in the literature. The first thing, autonomy is not about independence. It's not about doing things on your own. You can be autonomously dependent or interdependent with others. If you're willingly following the lead or guidance of others, you can also be autonomously independent at times if you decide you want to do something on your own and people give you the freedom to do that. So autonomy and independence are different constructs altogether. And it's not about separateness from other people, and it's not about individualism. In fact, one of the things that I've written about pretty extensively recently is the most autonomous things we do typically are about connecting with other people, expressing our love and care for others. These are the most common autonomous goals. So it has nothing to do with individualism. And of course, our cross-cultural work shows that you can be autonomously collectivistic or autonomously individualistic. And if anything, the cross-cultural data is showing that autonomy is maybe more important in collectivistic contexts than it is in individualistic contexts, although important everywhere. And finally, and this is really important in the classroom environment, autonomy is not about giving people freedom. Freedom means removing constraints, but just removing constraints alone does not in any way necessarily support autonomy. In fact, if you just remove all constraints in most classrooms, which have been extremely controlled in the first place, you just get chaos. All kinds of heck will break loose in that. So it's not that you get autonomy from freedom, although freedom can sometimes allow autonomy. So an absence of restriction still doesn't leave you with a purposeful goal that you can stand behind, which would represent autonomy. So we make these conceptual distinctions because they're really important in all of our considerations of practice. Now, I'm going to, because I'm just introducing the basic concepts of SDT, I'm going to go deeply into the idea of autonomy because we see autonomy taking different forms. And we, in fact, have I guess you'd say, a taxonomy or a model of motivation, which has multiple kinds of motivation that we see every day in classrooms that vary in their relative autonomy. At the bottom of that continuum of autonomy is what we call amotivation. Amotivation is when you're not motivated to engage in something. And we really explore and research two fundamental causes of amotivation. One cause of amotivation is I can't do this. I'm being asked to do things I don't have the ability to do, so I'm not going to try. So lack of competence or lack of control over outcomes is one reason to be amotivated. But a second reason is that I don't even care. I mean, you're asking me to do something, whether I can do it or not, I don't find value in it. I don't find interest in it. And so I have no reason to be motivated. So both of these are the sources of amotivation. And I have to say, having this week visited a classroom here in the city of Rochester, I found a lot of amotivated students, self-reported amotivated students, who said, there's nothing going on here of any interest or relevance to me. Why should I be motivated? And I couldn't help but kind of agree with them about some of the materials that they were talking about. The next on this list of motivations is external motivation, and this is a common form of motivation. This is when we're motivated because somebody has rewards or punishments that they are hanging over us, and we're complying with those contingencies. This is the form of motivation that was studied for 50 years pretty exclusively by behaviorists before we took the Copernican turn to look at the other side of this. And one of the things that we would claim in self-determination theory is external motivation can be really powerful. If you have a big enough reward or a scary enough punishment, you might be able to get people to comply. That is not the problem with external motivation. The problem is that once you've got people motivated by those means, they're going to not be motivated unless you continue to give them the rewards or threaten the punishments. In other words, it's not a sustainable form of motivation, and it actually undermines internal motivation because once the external motivations are removed, so goes all motivation. Still further up on this continuum is what we call introjection. And again, this is something we probably all know and see in many of our students, which is motivation by internal pressure that's associated with self-esteem. So I'm motivated to do well in school because if not, I'm going to feel terrible about myself, or my parents are going to find me really disappointing. Or I'm motivated to do well in school because I want that external approval or those external rewards. This means that my motivation is based all around my ego and whether I'm going to be able to get self-esteem or stay away from a blow to my self-esteem. And again, it's a really powerful form of motivation. I have a lot of introjection myself, so I know how it pushes me around in life. I don't have doubts about that. The trouble with introjection is it really runs you into problems when you start to have competence difficulties or when you start to get negative feedback. It can really have a blow to your well-being. And also, it's not as fully engaged as the types of motivation I'm going to turn to now. Still higher on this continuum is what we call identification or integration. I'm going to combine them here. And that's when you're motivated because you really understand the value of something. So I'm doing my schoolwork because I do know that this is important to the career I want to go into, or I see the relevance of this to my everyday life. These would be good reasons for engaging in activity, even if it's not inherently interesting. I see why it matters, and therefore I'm willing to do it. So it's a self-endorsement of goals, and goals that, and if it's truly integrated, it's also goals that are congruent and well-fitting with all the rest of the goals that you have in life. And then finally is intrinsic motivation, where, as I said before, we started our work. Intrinsic motivation is when somebody's doing something because they find it inherently interesting. They like the challenges that are involved. They find the material stimulating or enjoyable to work with. And this is also, like identification and integration, a highly autonomous form of motivation. There's a lot of willingness going on when you're intrinsically motivated to do something. Now, intrinsic motivation still is at the heart of all of our work, even though we started there, because we think most learning in life is pushed or is brought about by our intrinsic motivation. Every day we're learning new things because we just are interested in what's going on in the world around them. Of course, I've turned off the news for the past few days because I'm not interested in it, but I probably will get back to it. But when all through life we're learning, and it's mostly out of intrinsic motivation. And it's hugely important in schools because having some intrinsic motivation for your schoolwork turns out to be pretty essential to doing well in school itself. Now, the reason I put the slide up is mainly because that's my granddaughter there with the puzzle in her hand at her first day of preschool and 3 years old. So I just really wanted to put the picture up, and it was just an excuse. Just about the importance of intrinsic motivation in school. We've seen in lots of studies that students' intrinsic motivation for their schoolwork is predictive of their performance, both directly predictive of performance, but also through engagement. And one of the nice studies that I like to look at in that is a study by John Froyland and Frank Worrell, where they looked at really differentiated student population, ethnically diverse student population, and showed that across types of students, this model still held up. Also, Genevieve Taylor has a good study in this as well. So in self-determination theory, we see this continuum of motives that really go from kind of alienated motivation, external motivation, being pushed around by others, all the way up to being self-motivated when you're integrated and have intrinsic motivation what you're doing. And we see much better outcomes as you move to the right-hand side of this motivation continuum than if you stay hanging around the left. I just also want to point out that most of us, for everything we do, have multiple motives at work. Like I might be identified with the purpose of giving this lecture today that David and Lee asked me to do. I'm also interjected around it, which is I feel like I better do well or else I'll feel bad about myself afterwards. Well, I will anyway. But so I have some interjected and some identified motivation going on. And hopefully I'm also, as I listen to you and have this discussion today, will find also some fun in it. People always have multiple motives at work in what they're doing. Every student will have some multiple motives at work. They might feel externally pushed, but also might find some interest in something. You can find combinations of these things, and that's why we score them together when we look at holistically at students' motivation. But we think, the more you're up at that right-hand side, the better the outcomes. And so the question is, how do we get people there? And I just want to show you the outcomes are better than up there. There's so many studies in SDT that I'm going to rely today in just this overview on meta-analyses, because meta-analyses are summaries of so many studies across the field. And in this case, it's a meta-analysis that was led by Josh Howard when he was looking at the motivation continuum and its predictive capacities with respect to outcomes in schools. And in this meta-analysis, we looked at 26 different school-related outcomes: performance outcomes, well-being outcomes, goal orientations, persistence, all kinds of outcomes, to see how they were predicted by where you are on this continuum of autonomy. And just a summary graph of that, in one analysis, in this meta-analysis, we grouped the adaptive outcomes together and the maladaptive outcomes just to form some super variables for illustrative purposes. Adaptive outcomes included performance, engagement, efficacy, mastery approach, vitality, and positive affect in school. And you can see that the further you go to toward the autonomous end of the continuum, the more those adaptive outcomes are present. So correlations go up between the motivation style and adaptive outcomes as you move along that continuum. And the opposite is true for maladaptive outcomes. So you can see that amotivated students and externally driven students have more absenteeism, more dropout intention, more anxiety, more depression, more boredom. Now, again, I go back to there was almost a 250,000 students involved in the study, 344 samples. So it's a pretty large sample. Also, they looked across to see whether there were cultural differences in that and found no really meaningful moderators of that. Now, a lot of people are concerned with grade point average and performance in schools, and just to kind of bring that out for those people who have that concern, you can see that there's almost a linear relationship here between more autonomous motivation and higher grades in school, both objectively recorded and also self-reported performance in school. But in SDT, I think, although I love to see performance outcomes, our main concern is the thriving of students and their wellness. And so these graphs, I think, perhaps interest me the most. And these are graphs about well-being and ill-being associated with each of these motivational types. And again, you can see that when you are amotivated, you have lower well-being. And when you are identified and intrinsically motivated, you have higher well-being. And the opposite is true for ill-being indices, things like depression, anxiety, negative affect. That's higher when you have amotivation and external regulation, and lower when you have intrinsic motivation in the classroom. So across domains, but certainly in the domain of education, there's pretty solid evidence that autonomous motivation predicts more engagement, more commitment to goals, better performance, and greater well-being. And again, we're not finding any strong moderation of this across cultures or countries or age. So the question in SDT is, how do we promote more autonomous motivation in the classroom? How do we help children become more intrinsically motivated and more identified in their schoolwork? And the answer to that in SDT is we support their basic psychological needs. And we try and avoid thwarting their basic psychological needs, because thwarting psychological needs pushes people down to the external and amotivated parts of the continuum, and supporting basic logical needs fosters and catalyzes people being up on the upper end of it. So we support competence, and we're, again, over the next bunch of meetings, this is going to be the focus of the discussions here, which is how do we support competence? What are the strategies and particular techniques? So these are just some general ideas that are on this slide, but we design activities so that the dominant experience is mastery. We don't want students involved in a lot of activities where they can't experience mastery, because that quickly contributes to amotivation. In order to help students master the tasks that are given to them, we provide a structure, which is scaffolding them so that they can acquire the skills that they need, and reducing the cognitive load so they can focus on the things that are important to feeling that sense of success. Really important in SDT is how we give feedback to people. That feedback is what we call informational rather than controlling or evaluative. Informational means that feedback is always focused on trying to help people feel more competence for the activity that they're in, giving them information about how to do things better or what pathway they might be able to take, rather than evaluative, which is comparing them with other people or making a judgment about them based on it. So we always are looking for informational feedback, and in one way that takes the form of making sure that we focus our praise and our positive feedback on effort that people put in and specific accomplishments, rather than on ability or how they're doing next to others. And then, we're always trying to help people see the areas for growth, why learning this particular skill is a movement toward something greater. And this is, of course, something where we convey the meaning and importance of activities while we're promoting competence. When we think about relatedness support, again, there's lots of ways to support relatedness, but it's always about conveying respect for the individuals involved, so they can feel like they're really significant and they matter in the environments in which they're acting. So when people are having challenges or they're facing problems, we're approaching them with care and concern rather than criticism or evaluation. We're making sure everybody feels inclusiveness. And I've often said in talks, and I'm sure all of you have heard me say this before, one of the items that I like that predicts relatedness is the item, my teacher likes me. Not, I like my teacher, but my teacher likes me, that something's been done to convey to the student that they matter to the teacher. And, again, opportunities to contribute and share in classrooms help people feel more a sense of inclusion and more sense of being significant and mattering in that atmosphere. And finally, autonomy support, which I think we'll probably focus the most on, is always begins in SDT with trying to understand the perspective of the person you're motivating, understanding the perspective of the student, and sometimes what we call the internal frame of reference when we're getting technical, meaning we're trying to understand the world as it's seen by the other person. We're interested in their ideas, their input, their reactions to what we're doing. Part of when they engage in activities, we're trying to foster a sense of ownership and agency. And of course, this is facilitated when we give people choices, when we let people take the options to move in certain directions, they're going to feel more ownership and agency when they do so. When we're supporting autonomy, we're minimizing the shoulds, have tos, and externally controlling language, and we're enhancing the language of choice, participation, and agency. And if we want to get people to do something that they don't find immediately interesting or joyful or enjoyable to do, we need to provide a rationale for them to do it. A rationale gives people a reason for engaging in activity because it has now a meaning or a value to them. And this is how we're promoting identification in the context of classrooms. So rationales become really, really important. A rationale that's pitched at the level of the person who has to engage the activity, something meaningful for them. And then, finally, part of supporting autonomy is not resisting people's objections to what we're doing. It's actually embracing them. It's looking at the resistances and trying to take interest in what those resistances are so that we can help people see beyond them to engage in activity. And if we can't empathize with that resistance, I think then we just let it fester underneath the surface. It's addressing it, giving voice to it, and then seeing if we can overcome those obstacles with both reasons and with enjoyable process. So autonomy becomes kind of central to SDT because when you support somebody else's autonomy, you're taking their point of view. So you're engaging in relatedness with them, and they feel more closely connected when they think that you understand their point of view or when you take interest in it. You're also supporting their competence because when you understand the frame of reference somebody else, you're going to automatically see the competence struggles and the challenges that they're facing, and that's going to help you design more optimal experiences for them to engage in. And, moreover, we talk about structure, we talk about involvement helping to support relatedness, and structure helping to support autonomy. But I think in SDT, we think both those things, structure and autonomy, structure and involvement, happen best through autonomy support. So if I'm going to provide structure, I do it in an autonomy supportive way. And if I'm going to be involved and dedicating my resources to somebody else, it's not because I'm controlling them or pressuring them, it's because I'm supporting their autonomy. So autonomy support becomes the lens through which both structure and involvement get accomplished to produce need satisfaction. And by the way, I stole this figure from John Marshall Reeves' chapter in the handbook on self-determination theory. So sorry, John Marshall. So again, lots of evidence that need supportive teaching does indeed improve outcomes for students. This was a recent meta-analysis that was done by Renal King, Joseph Ha, and Yi Wang, where they were looking, and here you see that they captured in this meta-analysis over 500,000 students in 70 different nations. So it's a pretty broad and multicultural meta-analysis. And this is just the kind of summary graph from that. They show that needs supportive teaching is a positive predictor of subjective well-being, of life satisfaction. It's a negative predictor of negative affect. It's a predictor of meaning in life. And the thing that's at the bottom, cognitive well-being, shows that it's also related to achievement. So here in cognitive well-being, they were using the PISA scores for reading, which they could find across all of these people. So they also tried to find moderators, like was gender a moderator, was socioeconomic status a moderator, was the type of country, whether it was democratic or whether it was totalitarian, whether it was in certain regions of the world, that any of those things strongly moderate these relationships, and they did not find strong moderations. There was some minor moderations in East European countries, but other than that, they concluded that this generally supported the universality of these processes across these 70 nations. another meta-analysis that was just recently done was led by Josh Howard, and they were looking at need support and need thwarting. So they also added the need thwarting to their meta-analysis in student populations. And this, again, was a very large meta-analysis across many, many countries. I forget the particulars of this now. But one of the things that theirs shows above and beyond what Ronald King and colleagues showed was how autonomy thwarting and can really have a cost for students. And you see here that when it comes to grades, autonomy thwarting is really associated with lower grades, and autonomy thwarting is associated with lower engagement, and it's associated positively with misconduct in classrooms. So the more students are feeling autonomy thwarted and relatedness thwarted in classrooms, the more likely they are to act out and engage in non-pro-social behavior within classroom environments. So, again, there's so many studies and so many cool results to take a look at, but I don't want to go there now. I really kind of want to make the point that these meta-analyses establish quite, I think, convincingly that needs supportive teaching, basic psychological needs supportive teaching is really good for students. And so therefore, we should be able to do interventions to help increase that autonomy support within classrooms. And really, we've been doing interventions in classrooms really from the beginning. At DC and I started doing interventions really about 1979 with classroom teachers here in the city of Rochester. And by the way, today I'm not in Australia. I'm in the city of Rochester. And just so how motivated I am, it was minus 15 Celsius today when I got up. I did go out and shovel my driveway and got ready for this talk today. So it's a cold outpost here in northern USA, but a great city. But anyway, we started doing workshops here really right from the beginning. And, I think we've learned a lot over time. But one of the big contributions recently was really led by John Marshall Reeve and Sung-Hyun Chon, who developed a workshop style drawing on the knowledge in SDT, and they disseminated it into this book. And this is what we spent the last bunch of sessions of this group, a smaller version of this group, discussing was the various chapters in this book on how you can support student motivation in the classroom. But a main point about this is that Chon and Reeve and others have been running controlled trials on this intervention workshop that's described in the book, and they've had remarkable success. One of the earlier reviews on this, which I think was done in 2021, looked at 51 different intervention studies, and 94% of them produced a significant effect, and almost all of those had a very large effect. Not just a small effect, but a large effect, an effect size greater than 1. So showing that these are robust effects on classroom experiences. And again, probably at some point in here, we'll look more closely at this data, but there's benefits of participating in this workshop, not for teachers, not just for their students, but for themselves. So what the data shows is that when you just introduce more autonomy supportive strategies into your classroom, students show greater engagement. They feel better about their own competence in school, so they have higher academic self-concept. They're less disengaged, which is obviously the opposite of greater engagement. They're engaged in less problematic behaviors, and they have better performance in school. One of the things about telling a joke on Zoom is you can't hear any laughter. So what they say, it sounds like everything falls flat. So anyway, also, not only are there benefits for students, but there's benefits for teachers as well. So what's I think remarkable from these interventions is once teachers start to engage in more autonomy supportive techniques in the classroom, they feel more satisfaction from their teaching. They feel greater intrinsic motivation for their teaching. They have more vitality in the classroom, and they have less exhaustion because, of course, it's less exhausting to deal with students that are engaged than students who are disengaged. And they have an increased sense of relatedness with students, which is something enhancing to teachers' own well-being. So we've been able to see benefits both to students and teachers from participating in this workshop. Now, I was involved in just one study recently that was nice that I was invited to be a co-author on the study, but it had to do with a concept that probably many of you have heard, which is we don't need more support for students. They need to get more grit. They need to get more mental toughness. What we want is students who can overcome the adversities of school with more resilience. And SDT has a different viewpoint on this. I don't think, and I think my co-authors here would agree with me that resilience or grit or mental toughness is built because you put adversity in people's way. In fact, what all the evidence shows is the more adversity you put in students' ways, the more they become disengaged, the more they feel less toughness, the less likely they are to persevere. What this data shows is that teachers who participated in this workshop and became more autonomy supportive had students who across the school year developed more grit and more mental toughness. So as we say, if you want to help people develop grit, give them support, don't give them adversity. We have kind of a backward theory about that in common culture, and I like this study because it kind of goes against that claim. There are many benefits to participating in these workshops, but this is one I just wanted to bring out. There's also less bullying in classrooms where teachers have gone through this workshop. There's, again, higher performance, so many good outcomes, but this is one I just happen to like. So all of these workshops are essentially helping teachers to become more autonomous supportive within the school structure that they have. And I think probably all of us know that we're kind of handed school structures over which we sometimes as teachers don't have a lot of control. But even within the kind of controlling curriculum-driven, STEM-driven courses that most of us have in K through 12 these days, even within that structure, engaged in more autonomy supportive techniques is beneficial to everybody. But I do want to say that, if SDT were having its way, it wouldn't just be working under the umbrella of the classroom that teachers have. It'd be also redesigning schools so that their basic features were more supportive of basic psychological needs. And I hope that's something we come to discuss more deeply as time goes on, because obviously there's so many things we do in schools that from an SDT standpoint are thwarting of basic psychological needs and are unproven and yet turn out to be pervasive. Like grading kids every day on everything they do. There's no evidence that this is good for motivation. There's no evidence it's good for long-term performance, yet it's the most pervasive practice we have in schools. Things like that would be parts of redesigning schools that we might rethink. But I kind of want to move on just quickly to say, it's not just about supporting the autonomy for students, it's also about supporting teachers' basic psychological needs as well, because if teachers' basic psychological needs are not addressed, they can't bring the energy to the classroom that's required for being autonomy supportive. And one of the things I do know from all of the work that we've done here in the United States is that teachers are leaving the profession, increasingly many, because they cannot feel autonomy in what they're doing. They don't feel they in fact feel micromanaged in the classroom, and it deprives them of a kind of satisfaction that they can have. Anyway, there's lots of evidence on this too, and I'm just going to bring out a couple studies here. This was done in Australia and was led by Rebecca Coley, and what she was looking at is teachers' sense of having their own autonomy supported by principals and their leaders within the school. And what she and her colleagues showed here was more perceived autonomy support led teachers to feel more competence and autonomy in their job, which led to higher well-being for teachers and higher job satisfaction. So it's really important to recognize that autonomy support is important for everybody, not just students, but for teachers alike. I got to be involved in a study in China on the same topic with Yuyan Ni, was the lead investigator. We were looking at Chinese elementary schools and principal autonomy support for teachers. And when teachers felt that their principal was more autonomy supportive, they had more intrinsic motivation and identified regulation for the job of teaching, and that was associated with higher job satisfaction. So again, supporting teachers' autonomy turns out to be really important. One way of thinking about this is just to look at a meta-analysis on teachers' work motivation. This was led by Gavin Schlemp. Really a fascinating meta-analysis, came out in 2020. And here he shows that when teachers feel support for their three basic psychological needs, when they feel support for their own autonomy, when they feel support for their own competence development, and then when they feel connected and inclusion in the school itself, this leads them to be more autonomously motivated for their work and less controlled in their motivation. And this turns out to predict their own well-being and lower distress. But really importantly, it ties into a whole chain of work in SDT that shows when teachers have more autonomy for their job, they are more autonomy supportive of students. And that remarkable finding keeps turning up all over the place, but you see it here in the meta-analysis of autonomous motivation predicting more autonomy supportive teaching. So, one of the things I would say is SDT, because that evidence base has grown so much over these 40 years, has a pretty strong evidence base. It has a pretty strong set of findings that says if you do these things in schools, of supporting autonomy, of supporting competence, of supporting relatedness, students will better flourish. So we know a lot about that, but at the same time, we don't see school policies directed at promoting these basic psychological needs. In fact, there are very few such policies that we've been able to find around the world, which I'll talk about in a minute. But we have a ton of policies and practices which have no support in the literature at all, but which probably have a strong thwarting effect on basic psychological needs. And I just use a couple examples here. High stakes tests. In the United States, we're burdened by high stakes testing all the time of policymakers who are using tests as the kind of criteria by which they're going to measure schools. And the result of a focus on high stakes testing is that teachers have less autonomy and control over their own curriculum, so they can be less appealing and provide less enthusiasm for lessons in the classroom, and it results in lower teacher and student engagement when the curriculum is dictated through that high stakes testing lens. Another example, as I mentioned before, is ubiquitous grading. Again, you go into most schools around the world and you find that almost every day they're being graded and evaluated on something. And I ask all of us to think, how do we like it if every day we were being graded and evaluated on everything that we do? Our motivation would be hurt by that if that was the nature of what our work was every day. So it's not that there's no place for evaluations in schools, no place for any kind of grading, but the ubiquity of it and the undermining effect that has is something that's just not studied enough. And one of the things that we've seen is in the best countries around the world in terms of quality of teaching, teachers have a lot of autonomy. If we're looking at places like Finland or Singapore, some of the highest rated classrooms in the world, there's a lot of investment in teachers. There's investment in teachers' salaries. There's investment in teachers' professionalism. And there's a sense of, if we can create that professionalism in teachers, then we can also give them the right to teach their classrooms in the way that they see fit and to facilitate student engagement. And again, I point to Finland as a great example of where that teacher autonomy really pays off in having students of all types benefit. We've been working on a cross-cultural article recently that I'm doing for a special issue in Educational Psych Review. And one of the things that we just thought when we were starting this article was, we've done a lot of cross-cultural reviews on how there's universality of basic psychological needs. But what we haven't reviewed a lot is what are the different obstacles in different countries for getting policies in place that support students' basic psychological needs. So if you look at this overall diagram of SDT's view of education, we do know, as I've already been talking about, that a proximal context where teachers support autonomy, competence, and relatedness leads to more need fulfillment in students, and that leads to more engagement. But social, cultural, economic factors often have an impact on whether teachers are even in a position to provide that support. And so in this study, which we're just finishing up now to submit, we had people from 10 different countries write a scenario about what's going on in their country that's in the way of SDT being more central in the policies of educators within the country. And we find different things in different countries. So for instance, in South Korea, for instance, it's a high achievement oriented culture with a Confucian background. And there's a lot of people who are afraid that if you are being supportive of autonomy, that you're not pushing people to have the highest performance. And then we can see, given that cultural ideology, how sometimes support for autonomy might be crowded out in the classroom. At the same time, as you can look at a country like Singapore, which has been also a high-achieving Asian country, but they have incorporated SDT techniques as part of their National Institute of Education teacher training as an invariant part of that training because they see the importance of that in the classroom. We see the same thing in Flanders, in Belgium, At the same time, teachers across the country are being trained in autonomy supportive techniques and SDT techniques, but then in comparable countries like Germany, it still has no large role in teacher training or public policy. So uh, some obstacles are ideological and cultural obstacles. Sometimes they are just resource obstacles. So in some other countries, we're seeing that, in Peru, where there's been really, I think Lenya Matos is on this call, there's been really nice evidence for the importance of SDT in classrooms. There's not resources for teacher training because of the impoverishment of rural schools and the shortage of teachers and the high classroom sizes to get in the way of doing these things. So we can find obstacles in every country, in every culture, in every setting that are in the way. And I think part of where we need to be going is taking our evidence base and getting it more embedded into public policy in a way that gives teachers the support they need for supporting needs in the classroom. Well, obviously I can go on a lot, and I tend to do so. So I'm going to try and sum up quickly, which is just a few takeaways. SDT is a general framework, but it argues that every student is motivated. Every student wants to grow. Every student wants to learn, but sometimes they withdraw that energy because they're not finding the conditions that support their wellness in classrooms. When we support students' basic psychological needs, they're more likely to be intrinsically motivated or to internalize the value of learning. And teachers too, they need their own autonomy supported. And when they do so, they're more autonomy supportive of the students in their classrooms. We have demonstrated that workshops can enhance effectively teachers' autonomy support in the classroom with great outcomes for both students and teachers. At the same time, there's a lot of obstacles across, and they're different in each country, to getting these practices more instantiated in the schools around us. I guess the final point I just want to reiterate, which is we can enhance motivation in the schools that we have. We can also start thinking more creatively about the schools that we need to design to have students have the best outcomes. And with that, I think I'm going to stop and just say, thanks, Shannon, for getting this started, and David.